So we're gonna change gears here. This is a panel on AI ethics, law, and policy. And let's see, since I don't know where people are sitting when I call your name, raise your hand. Todd Solomon, great. Katie Stebbins, great. Catherine Tucker, thank you. And Daniel Weissner, thank you. And so why don't we start with Todd? Is that okay?
Great,
good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So as the lawyer on the panel, I was going to talk a little bit, just some introductory remarks on AI in the workplace from a legal perspective and also a human resources perspective, and talk about some of the things that are actually happening with AI in the workplace, and then from a legal standpoint, who's liable when things go wrong, which obviously is a complex topic. So AI in the workplace is obviously a huge development. The Society of Human Resource Management had a study where they said $14 billion has been spent on AI in the workplace over the last 5 years. So obviously critical to figure out where it fits in terms of the human resources functions. So to talk about some of the things that are happening in the workplace, one of the things that we see is resume screening. So using artificial intelligence to screen resumes and streamline the hiring process. And what's great about that is it can eliminate unconscious bias from the process and make it more automated. What is tricky about it is that it can create biases of its own depending on the programming. Oftentimes, the AI will seek out candidates who are similar to ones that have been successful before. So it can actually perpetuate some of the stereotypes or issues in the workplace with the hiring process going in. Another development, a company called HireVue has created an interesting tool where they analyze interviews for companies, and GE and Hilton have used this in their interview process. And they analyze everything from somebody's engagement, their motivation, the words they use, whether they show empathy in the interview, and help employers better choose their candidates through the screening process. And I think that's a real interesting development. One that's near and dear to my heart as an employee benefits lawyer is robo-advisors on the 401k investment side. So most people operate, if they contribute to their 401k at all, operate without investment advice. So there's a push to get cheaper advice available to people who otherwise couldn't afford it, and robo-advisors have filled that gap. A few small companies have issued robo-advice tools, and even the big players, Vanguard and Schwab, have created an element to this. And the key question there is, under ERISA, which is the federal benefits law, can a robo-advisor serve the fiduciary function? Any investment advice under ERISA has to be fiduciary in nature, and that's the key question that people go back and forth on, is can the robo-advisor serve that fiduciary role? Obviously, the industry says yes, and I think we'll see more robo-advisors. In terms of legal liability, the key question is determining the legal standard. So there's one school of thought where you could say, well, AI shouldn't be responsible at all for example, discrimination in the workplace if there's a screening tool or something like that. We wouldn't normally attach legal liability to non-human actors. So if you have animals in an animal attack or a bee sting, you wouldn't charge the bee with assault, right? But in the AI perspective, you have the employer standing behind this, and that creates an interesting issue from a liability perspective, because there's a legal doctrine called Respondeat Superior. It's Latin for master servant. So what the agent does of the employer, it goes back to the employer, and the employer can be liable for that. So if somebody's driving a car, doing a delivery, and they hit somebody negligently, the employer can be held responsible for that. And similarly with AI, you would think that the employer would have to have some responsibility, but the question is, does there have to be negligence? And if so, is it negligence in the programming? Is it negligence in the execution? Where is that liability standard drawn? And can those people that were involved in programming point fingers at one another? So, if the employer is liable, might it go after the programmer, who might go after somebody else? And it leads to kind of a complex web of who's liable for what. The last point I'll make is, obviously in the workplace, AI can't do everything, and certainly in the legal market, that's kind of a focus of attention, is where does AI fall short on things like legal opinions? So AI can perform legal research, but can it use the judgment or business judgment to actually issue a legal opinion? So there's a lot of attention paid to that, but clearly it's here to stay, and clearly it's something that's going to develop additional legislation and regulations. And much like some of the other technological advances, that will follow in time as it gets bigger. You know, Uber and Lyft is a great example, right, of a technological innovation that came on the scene, and there was very little regulation when it first came out, and now we're seeing lawsuits every week on Uber getting challenged for this or that in its employment practices or wage and hour, things like that. So I think that's what we can expect to see from a legal standpoint with AI as it becomes more prevalent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I want to thank Lori and CSAIL and MIT for having us today, first of all. This has just been such an incredible day. I was saying it's so hard to speak at the end of a conference because all I want to do is provide a commentary for everything I've heard today, but I need to focus. I'm going to focus. So I'm going to give a slightly different twist. I want to talk about AI and the future of government work, because I am a public servant. I've worked in government for 20 years, and I want to bring you all a postcard from the rest of America outside of Boston. Let's talk about local government, and let's talk about the fact that how many of you think when I got up every morning to work for a mayor in a local government, my directive was transparency and accountability? Anybody? Yeah, that's right, because it wasn't. So I came to government in this sort of just graduated from college. I wanted to be Erin Brockovich. I wanted to uncover all the toxic waste in this world. I wanted to hold people accountable, right? Like, this is what I wanted to do. And I got into government, and they're like, oh, no, no, you don't understand. This is all based on relationships and power, not data. What do you mean data? And I said, but I uncovered all this information. I did like public information. Like, I have all this information. Katie, we don't want your data. Relationships, power. If you build relationships, you will have power. 23 million people in this country are employed in government. That's a lot of people. We have almost 90,000 local governments, or how we're organized in this country. So as we talk about this, I think about the democratization of AI. I think about these systems. I think about ethics, law, and policy. Let's think about who makes these laws. Let's think about how these policies are done. So in my past job working in tech innovation and entrepreneurship for the governor of Massachusetts, we were talking about self-driving cars quite a bit. And the conversation around self-driving cars and testing them on our roads seemed very straightforward here in Boston. You make a car, you want to test this, you put it on the road, who wouldn't want to do this? But you know what we didn't account for? The snowplow driver. Who do you think holds an enormous amount of power in New England in the winter? And who do you think's afraid of losing his job? And so the way we had crafted the policy of testing cars in this home rule state was you had to get approval by the local municipality. Who do you think the lawyer, who do you think the mayor is going to listen to? Are they going to listen to folks at MIT and Toyota who, for no monetary compensation, want to test on their roads? Or are they going to listen to their cousin, right? And their cousin's cousins, and their brother's mother's cousin's brother's mother's cousin, who drives all the plows, who, by the way, in the municipality I lived in, you knew where the power was because you could eat off of those roads every time there was a snowstorm. There was never snow on the powerful roads. That wasn't about data. It wasn't about which road had the most snow on it. It wasn't about being in a cyber-physical system, right? It was about power. So as the city and town becomes a connected cyber-physical system, how do we take these conversations we're talking about today, and how do we transport them to the local level in a way that augments decision-making, in a way that does build trust and accountability, right? But finds a way to create power trade-offs. So that if you are someone who has relationships and power, and you are a decision maker and you're making policy, you are somehow brought together with this new cyber-physical system and artificial intelligence, and you have the new capacity to maintain a power, to shift your power, to have different power, because let's face it, we're not going to eliminate power, right? It's still a motivator. You don't go to work for money in government. You go to work for either what I did, to be Erin Brockovich, or for power. And so we just need to think about, as we deploy these systems, how we really educate at the local level our policymakers, our leaders, and how they can adopt these systems. Thank you.
All right, so I'm the professor on this panel, so therefore it behoves me to talk a little bit about some research, but it's going to have some consequences for this general topic of AI and ethics. And the research I want to tell you about is some research we did into whether or not algorithms that deliver advertising are biased. And to be specific, what we were looking at was we were looking at the delivery of an ad for careers in STEM, something we think is useful to publicize, something we know that we're worried about in terms of the future path of our country. And we went to see, well, how does an advertising algorithm decide who sees ads for future jobs in STEMs? And what we found was this big headline result, which was that these ads were shown 20% more to men than to women. And the question then becomes, well, why did that happen? Now, I must admit, when I present this research, there's the usual attitude in the room that somehow it must be self-inflicted, that the algorithm was learning from the fact that women were just disinterested in these ads. But that wasn't the case. Indeed, if the women ever saw the ads, they were far more likely to click on them than if they didn't. So that wasn't the case. So what actually was explaining it? Well, it was something quite unexpected to us, which is simply this. In the online advertising world, women are just more expensive to advertise to. Sometimes it's put less kindly and just we're told that men are cheap to advertise to. But the focus was that women are more expensive to advertise to. Therefore, unless you tell an advertising algorithm that you want to counteract this, it will try and automatically cost minimize for you and show the ad to more men than women. Now, that's a simple story, but it has, I think, 3 potential implications for thinking about this question about ethics and algorithms and potential bias. The first is the world of AI introduces a lot of complexity into how decisions are made, and these may have unintended consequences. It's not the case that all those advertisers who are bidding up female eyeballs in order to show them ads for laundry detergent were nefariously trying to deprive females of economic opportunity, right? That wasn't their intention. It was just the after effects of what they did. So we have a lot of complexity in the system. The next thing to say is that it raised for me the question of there's a lot of times we talk about algorithms being biased or algorithms doing discrimination. But here, it's not clear to me that it's really discrimination or necessarily bias in any of the old words we used to think of it in terms of being intentional. Instead, what there is just simply a lack of information over how these algorithms may actually try and act in the purported advertiser's favor. And so it's one of these things where now I've said it, everyone's like, oh, I haven't thought about that before. Easy to solve, just make sure I bid more for female eyeballs than male eyeballs. So it's an easy solution, but we just have to understand the algorithm to try and counteract it. The last thing I just want to emphasize is this point of a counterfactual. As a story, it could have a headline, MIT professor finds advertising algorithms biased against females. But the real question is, what is the counterfactual? Would me putting that ad in the New York Times, what would be the relative consequence for females or males seeing that ad? And so I'm just sharing that story as a means of opening up the debate. Thank you very much. Okay, very good.
Catherine, do I get your 40 seconds? No. So Catherine has given a great example of a challenge about the way that artificial intelligence systems work and what might happen when they collide with the legal system. And I'm going to explore that question with you a little bit further. I want to start off with just one observation, that will lead to the way I think of the question, it's striking when you talk to people who are building these systems, as you've heard today. On the one hand, they seem to be converging towards perfection. But on the other hand, it's very hard to explain how they work at the same time. So that's a very complicated situation for policymakers to think about. And beyond that, people are learning all kinds of ways to trick these systems, either to discover weaknesses or in some cases to get them to actually do things that are downright harmful. So we have a bunch of work going on, as you know. You heard from John in developing autonomous vehicles. And the regulatory question that I think is really compelling about thinking about autonomous vehicles is the question of whether we ought to think about these vehicles in the way we think about many of the machines that we use today. Is it a kind of a static mechanism that ought to conform to some set of rules and regulations that we can lay out and just build to those rules? Or is it somehow a more dynamic system that almost seems a little bit more like a person, more like a driver who we would want to give a driver's license test to before we would allow these things out on the road? I don't think it's going to be quite either one. I think there'll be a mix. But it's not going to fit, these autonomous vehicles, I don't think are going to fit neatly into either one of these categories. I want to tell you a story. I want to actually read you a story. And I hadn't realized that Antonia was going to show that particular video, so I hope you don't cry at the end of this story. But I want to read you a story from 1957 about an automobile accident that happened. It's an accident in which someone named Mrs. Arnold was crossing a street against the light and was hit and hurt by a driver named Mr. Arnold. She admitted that she was actually negligent in the way that she crossed the street, but she went to court to say that actually Mr. Ruther, the driver, should have avoided her anyway because he had the last best chance in legal terms to avoid the accident. And the court said something really interesting. Again, this is 1957, but I think it gives you an idea of how we might come to think of these systems. The court said that a human being, that is the driver, no matter how efficient, is not a mechanical robot and does not possess the ability of a radar machine, that's their words, to discover danger before it becomes manifest. Some allowance, however slight, must be made for human frailties and for reaction, and if any allowance whatever is made for the fact that a human being must require a fraction of a second for reaction and cannot respond with the mechanical speed and accuracy, such as found in modern mechanical devices, it must be realized that there was nothing Mr. Ruther could do. Now, what I think this story actually tells us is that we may bring to autonomous vehicles a set of expectations that might be hard to meet. And we're going to have a hard time figuring out how to calibrate expectations of these new systems as they come into our lives, whether they're cars or other kinds of autonomous systems that make decisions about us that have financial or health impact or whatever else it might be. And I want to suggest one way that I think this clearly won't happen. There are proponents of autonomous vehicles who say, well, they're much better than human drivers. I think that's a terrible answer, and it's never going to be accepted in the policy world, even certainly not with the snowmobile, the snowplow drivers. But I think instead what we're going to have to learn to do is to build what I think of as accountable autonomous systems. We're going to have to build systems that are able to explain themselves so that we can evolve over time a sense of what we should actually expect of these systems. This is going to create a number of sticky problems. Number one, it may be that the people who build these systems don't want to be all that accountable, don't want to open themselves up to liability. It may be that the people who build these systems are not so interested in sharing information about how their systems works with their competitors, but I would suggest to you they're going to have to, because that's the only way we're going to get any stable sense of what's safe and what's reliable. And I think it also is going to be necessary because people who go out and buy these systems and use these systems are going to have some basis for deciding what system to choose. So there's a lot of wonderful technical work going on in trying to generate explanations about autonomous systems. That's important from a usability perspective. What I want to suggest is also really important so that we can understand how to integrate these systems into the legal and regulatory environment that they're going to have to exist in. So thanks.
Great. So why don't we, since it's come up repeatedly, why don't we start with the car? Katie, you've described a reality that I think the industry is trying to get around by taking self-driving car regulations out of the localities, jurisdictions, and moving it to Congress. They're trying to use Congress. I don't know what luck they're going to have, but to what extent is the regulatory liability question going to slow down the deployment of self-driving cars at this point?
Certainly in Massachusetts, we went back and forth, and there's a lot of frustration. The policy has since been subject to some amendments, but the immediate reaction we had was, of course, we were going to structure it in a home rule way, because in Massachusetts, there's not every state in the country functions this way, but Massachusetts certainly does, is that our municipalities have the ability to augment, override, and make stronger laws that the state sets up. And so we defer to our municipalities a lot, and that's where the constituents come from. And we do believe that as your municipalities agree with you on things, you build state momentum around something. So certainly with people here in Boston saying we just need to create a policy where we can test them everywhere, what we were afraid of is that if you just then don't include the voice of the municipality, if there is something that happens on their streets, they're going to go, well, you didn't include us. We didn't talk about this. What are you doing here? We didn't let you in. And to us, I think it's important that everyone's together on these things, even though it means the length to technology, length to adoption, could be longer.
Dan, do you have any sense of the playoff between federal and local?
So, as you know, John, the mantra of many of the technology platform companies who are now bringing this AI expertise to the car market is design once and deploy globally. So there's a really pretty substantial mismatch if, as the two of you suggest, there's even local, like municipal control over autonomous vehicles. I think that, Congress is not in a great state to really lead on anything these days, but I think that what we all know is that for vehicles to be on the road, they have to be insured. That's established law today. No one has to do anything new to say that. So I think that in absence of any policy change, it's really going to be some kind of interaction between the insurers and the car manufacturers who are going to establish essentially a private arrangement about what minimum safety standards are before an insurance company is prepared to insure these systems, and then how people who own or operate these autonomous vehicles are going to use them. I think it was Daniela who suggested that these will be deployed in a lot of cases in much more controlled settings, off of public thoroughfares where a lot of these rules don't apply. And I think that'll probably be the first answer, and then we'll learn hopefully more about what to expect of these vehicles and start to develop regulatory
even post-testing,
approaches.
I think municipalities always have a concern that they're going to bear some cost, that there's going to be some cost that wasn't anticipated because you didn't ask us, right? That someone didn't come to us and ask us, and we could have told you. If you just come to us, we would have told you that this is going to cost this and this and this and this. It's going to disrupt this system, this system, this system, and now we're now we look like assholes because we didn't do it, and we weren't properly compensated or worked with to make sure that this system was put in place well, because ultimately, like all politics are local, all roads are basically local too.
Todd, AIs are out there in the world commercially now. Is there law that's spoken to the AIs that exist there out there? Is law keeping up?
I would not say it's keeping up. There is some law out there, and typically it follows what I guess I would call a negligence-ish type standard, that the AI by itself would not necessarily create liability unless there was negligence in the operation or in the design. That being said, it is changing very fast. So the EU proposed something just earlier this year, I believe, for more of what we would call a strict liability. standard. So, kind of like a product liability type standard. If something bad happens, you are responsible. So it's going to be interesting to see, maybe somewhere settle in the middle of that, or the answer is no, it isn't quite keeping up.
Isn't that striking in part because isn't that what the software industry in the United States has largely avoided to this date? So are they ultimately going to lose that battle because AI is software? Would you suggest that that's the trajectory?
Yeah, that is certainly possible, I would say.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And also, isn't Europe ahead of us in sort of forcing what's called transparency? And is it, okay, so that's a goal. Is it possible to make these things transparent?
Right. I think Europe's ahead on a number of related points. The other piece, which I didn't even get into, is with AI, especially in the employment process, with the quest for factual information. There are data privacy or privacy issues too, and Europe's certainly very far ahead in terms of protection of privacy and regulation of personal privacy. So yes, I do think they're a good bit further down the road on some of this.
Danny, what's the challenge of transparency?
I think that the challenge is, so here we know what the wrong answer about transparency is. I think the wrong answer is what has gone under the rubric of algorithmic transparency, that is somehow disclose all of your code and let people look around. And I think what is sort of plain to see is that the code that goes into developing a neural net, say, from a set of training data and evolving it, is really not going to tell you very much about how the system ultimately performs. So I think what we have to look at is much more kind of input and output data of the systems overall, and look over a period of time to say, well, how is any given system functioning based on what it actually does out in the world? Then I think the question of assigning who's responsible may get a little complicated if there are different contributors to that overall system. But from a consumer protection perspective, from a transparency perspective, I think what matters is, does the system perform according to some set of functional standards that both safety or other kind of regulators can understand, and ultimately that consumers can understand?
Before we go on in ethics, I wanted to just, in passing, years ago I wrote about how e-discovery was automating the legal profession, and so artificial intelligence was coming to the law. And more recently, Frank Levy, who is a now retired MIT labor economist, went back over that world and showed that, in fact, lawyers did a lot of things, and e-discovery was just one of them. And so that he had a very much more sort of sanguine notion of the impact of AI technology on the law. I just wonder if anybody on the panel has a general sense of how the incursion of these technologies is affecting the profession. I know you're not all lawyers, and maybe it's unfair, but...
I think it is affecting the ability to train junior lawyers. So in terms of future of employment, that there used to be, since there were no alternatives, the most junior person on the food chain, if you will, would do all of the rudimentary document review type things or research type things. And now there are a lot of AI tools that could research a discrete legal issue for you, produce a memo, and outline all of the case law, which is exactly what first-year associates at prominent law firms were doing. Not even, I was going to say 20 years ago, but forget that. 5 years ago, we're doing all that. So there is, an evolution in terms of who's doing what and what tools are available. But I still think, as I alluded to, there's aspects of judgment or aspects of, so much of actually practicing law for corporate clients, for example, is shades of gray. So, managing risk and communicating to clients where there's potential liability, but also managing business risk. And I don't think AI has kind of crept into that yet, but certainly could be trained to, I assume.
Catherine, in the scenario you described, can you see a way of adding transparency?
So the way I talk about the paper is really to make people think more about the issue of algorithmic transparency. In that I always feel, as a headline, it sounds so appealing because policymakers want to have a handle on algorithms, And who could ever argue with such a concept as like transparency? But, first of all, Daddy was being quite polite when he talked about the idea of putting lots of code on the web, right? If you ever mention this to a technologist, they tend to burst into outrageous laughter because it just means you don't understand coding to say that. The idea that you're going to look through some scripts and suddenly see the binary bit which says we hate females somewhere in it, it's just not going to happen. But the other thing I was just going to say is, say my research, right? I think it makes me question even more nuanced policies in that it emphasizes that we don't necessarily know what to look for. If we want to do an audit, how would you catch out this kind of spillover between all firms behaving very rationally? And so it makes me even think that the sort of more modified, thoughtful angle on algorithmic transparency may not get us where we want to get it.
To me, this actually converges with your question about the way the legal system functions in a more or less automated way. I mean, I think, with respect, since I was trained as a lawyer as well, the legal system is terrible about science. It's just not good. It doesn't understand how to integrate scientific evidence. It treats it as a sort of a purely adversarial proceeding between dueling experts most of the time. And what we're learning, but I think gradually the legal system is being dragged into having to deal with data because there's a lot more data in the world. And so on issues such as the question of fairness of sentencing prediction systems, Julia Angwin, many people I'm sure saw, did a great study of a particular system that judges use to try to predict recidivism risk. And there were actually some very interesting debates about the statistical kind of philosophy behind that study and what we should expect of a system that's, quote, fair. But I think we're all going to gradually get dragged into these discussions, exactly as Catherine said, that you have to look beyond a simplistic view of fairness and say, well, why did this result actually occur, and what does it say, and are we comfortable with what it means? So I think it's full employment for data scientists who can explain the analysis they do of all this data. And I think the legal system and the policy process is going to become incredibly dependent on those kind of people, in the same way as it was very dependent on more traditional engineers in the area of safety regulation or housing regulation or all those kind of things.
But I think one of the things that I worry about is not deploying those data scientists on the local level. And I've seen zoning ordinances get changed that we don't allow chickens in our town anymore because one apartment building found one family who had them in their cabinets, growing them there. Or we all need to have as many parking lots as possible because one business owner complained that their parking's not big enough. So now we've changed the zoning to allow, to force large lot zoning everywhere for parking lots. And so when we don't have the ability at the local level to make true analysis and to accept that data and to really look at it, we do shoot from our hip on constituent pain points. Right. And I think that a lot of policy and laws, especially at the local level, get crafted that way.
I would bring it back to your former world, John, where the press has had such an important role in scrutinizing lots of new technologies and really pushing to ask questions about fairness and safety and all that. And I think we're just starting to see also, a whole cadre of reporters who are getting really good at data, and hopefully that trickles down to the local level so that people can actually understand what's going on. On the one hand, you can hear Eric Schmidt talking about the fact that they basically make all the world's data available to everyone, which is true to a certain extent. But the question is, do we know what to do with it? Are we able to look at it? That's right.
And it costs money. And again, we were listening at lunch to the example from China. You do have to support these systems. You have to make a commitment to wanting to make the entire system smarter. And at the local level, you tend to have to compete for government grants in order to bring a talent in. And the most sophisticated towns will win at those grants, and the least sophisticated ones won't. And look at what's happened in our country right now. We have a lot of disparities between sophisticated and non-sophisticated, and it's become a challenge for us. So we have to deploy intentionally in a well-funded way.
There's a question from the audience on the AI is safer question. Ben Sprecher asks, even if AI is safer, is a bad answer, Won't lawsuits and insurance rates force autonomy into mainstream once truly safer?
Everybody's looking at me. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an interesting issue that I'm by no means an insurance expert, but I haven't dug into how insurance companies will react to AI in both. I mean, the workplace is another interesting one, is will employment insurance and fiduciary insurance and director and officer insurance, all the sort of corporate insurances that are out there, will there be additional change to ratings and cost of insurance? I'm not expert in that, but I strongly suspect there will be, but I'm not aware of that development to this point.
If I could, I think the leading edge of product liability law essentially looks at has the right level of investment been made to make the product reasonably safe. So that's why I think this idea of saying, well, the human-driven car would definitely have crashed in that situation is not really an answer to the autonomous vehicle, because the question that I think that ultimately gets asked about the autonomous vehicle is, did the designer of that system make a reasonable level of investment to avoid the harm? And we expect things to get better, and that was sort of the point of the little anecdote I read, that I think people expect machines to do a lot better.
So once again, we're out of time, but a final question. On Capitol Hill, 3 of the AI forward companies, Silicon Valley companies, are on the Hill today. Do you think that you've talked about how Europe is moving more quickly? Is there any chance that this will turn to a focus on regulating AI? These are 3 AI-centric companies that are before Congress. Is there any sophistication on the part of Congress that they're using these tools to?
I mean, not to be cynical, but I think that Europe's behavior as to an industry like the automobile industry, in which they have an enormous domestic interest and a tremendous competitive position, is going to be perhaps somewhat different than the behavior of what were frankly regarded as invading internet systems that scooped up all of Europeans' personal data and took it to California. So I just think we're in I think there's going to be a different mindset, a very different regulatory mindset, and how it comes. I think it may be that some of the Silicon Valley companies are a little bit more at risk in the US than they are in Europe on these kind of autonomous systems.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel. It just goes too fast.